Welcome, and thank you for tuning in to Lady K Chat, a podcast that is designed for men and women to become better versions of themselves, which is broadcast every Tuesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Various subjects will be spoken upon, such as relationships, health and wellness, personal development, wealth building, children, and so much more. She is a two-time Amazon best-selling author, an international speaker, and life coach. She is Lady K. And now for your host, Lady K.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Lady K Chat podcast. Here with your favorite host. And if you are tuning in for the very first time, I am the one that bring that fire. Don't hold my tongue back, but I tell it with love. So I want to thank you for me today. We are in the month of February, and all month long, we're going to be talking about Black history. Now, I have someone special with me. He's going to help me lay out some information. I like to call him like the walking dictionary. The information that he carries, he's very intentional. Please welcome my guest for today, Mr. Ronald Yates. He's owner of Ron and Romney Reasons. Welcome, Ron.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure being on with you.
Thank you, Ron. I thank you. I always tell people I thank you for accepting the invitation because you didn't have.
No, it's my
appreciate
pleasure.
you being here with me today. Thank you, Ron. So yeah, Ron. So this in the month of February, I want to talk about some history. Now I want to bring up a word some people is just getting used to because this terminology was not into search for, and I know a lot of people have heard the terminology Indigenous people. So they're like, where that terminology come from? So I'm happy to have you here today so we can go more into detail about the indigenous people. Who are they? Why are they so important and a major impact in the history,
Mm-hmm.
So,
well,
Ron.
The indigenous people were the people that were here in this hemisphere prior to the arrival of Columbus and the whole period of discovery. These people have been here for centuries, going back thousands of years. It is speculated that when the earth had not broken apart yet, meaning all of the continents at one point connected. So it's speculated that people walked up across what would be the land bridge between Russia and the United States and just migrated down into this part of the world, Central and South America, and lived there for hundreds of years, thousands of years before Columbus ever stumbled upon them. If you look at the history of this country and the way things are documented, when I guess this would probably be the early 19th century, latter half of the 18th, early part of the 19th century, the U.S. government opened up the floodgates to European immigrants. And that was because the population in this country was mostly people, would be today considered people of color. You have to keep in mind that Black people have been here well before the transatlantic slave trade. Right. In fact, if you study the Olmec culture, you find that the Olmecs were in Central and South America probably 3,000 years ago. And I printed out a picture of what the Olmecs look like. And as you can see, these are clearly characteristic features of Black people. There are about 7 of these Olmec heads that were found in Veracruz, Mexico in 1938. So we know from his history and from the study of Dr. Ivan Van Sertima's book that these are the people that taught some of the people in Mesoamerica cultures like building of pyramids. Mm-hmm. So you find pyramids pretty much of the same dimensions in Central and South America as you would find in Egypt or Kemet. So that information was bought, that exchange of culture and ideas was bought by the Olmecs, who crossed the Atlantic, like I said, centuries before Cristobal Colon, or who's commonly known as Columbus, was ever thought of. And in this country, in, like I said, the latter half of the 18th century, when the floodgates opened and they started giving out land grants, you find that the government's official paperwork says that the indigenous people of this country are the copper-skinned indigenous people. Who has the copper skin? So we know that there were people that looked like you and I that were here centuries before there was ever European on this hemisphere.
Right. And you know, Rod, I'm happy you broke that, because a lot of us, like you say, going into the history book, what they documented, make it seem that, you know, we was all brought here on slave ships, you know, and that all slaves. But to be honest, you just clearly indicated that's not the case. We all were not, you know, our grandparents and, you know, I'm sorry, not our grandparents, but our ancestors, like you said, were here already, and this was their land, which a lot of us are not in recognition that this is our land. The land belongs to us. So when you speak, but they'll be like, well, what do you mean by that? So I'm sure you can go into more into depth about that this land belongs to us. Can you talk about that?
Well, yeah. Again, you know, there are historical facts that show that Black people have been here hundreds of years before Columbus. It's speculated that even some of the Kemetic peoples, or as they're called, Egyptians, crossed the Atlantic as well, and that they came here and deposited again an exchange of cultural and intellectual and technological ideas amongst the people that lived here.
Okay.
So you have to keep in mind that there were a number of people that migrated. Of course, the migration began in Africa because we all have some degree of Africanness, because all human life can be traced back to a Black woman on the African continent. So at some point during the Great Migration, some people went north into Europe and then across the land bridge. Some of these people lost some of their pigmentation over time. Not all, but some. They became maybe somewhat lighter skinned versions of who we are now. And these are probably the people that the Olmecs and maybe the Kemetic people encountered when they came across the Atlantic. Okay. And there's currents, sea currents, that if you leave Africa, this current will bring you right into this hemisphere. And if you leave here, that same current kind of works counterclockwise, will take you right back to Africa. So I guess the indigenous Africans were aware of this sea current and would travel back and forth. You have to keep in mind that for the African empires, and there were many on the continent, they always looked for trade routes.
Right.
And some of those trade routes brought them across the Atlantic to trade with the people here and then return back to Africa. It's also quite possible that many of those explorers who came across remained here and stayed here and, you know, had families and children, and generations after them came from them remaining here on this continent. So yes, in terms of ownership of the land, I mean, that's a difficult concept.
Right.
Because then for people who have a spiritual connection, there is no such thing as ownership of the land. It was all a gift from the Most High that we shared. It was a
I like how you said that, Rod.
I'm sorry?
I like how you said that. It was a gift
from the Most High.
I love that. I love that.
That we shared. And it was a Eurocentric concept to come and say, well, I own this, right? That this is private property, that you can no longer travel across this particular stretch of land because I own it. Whereas, you know, that didn't exist in antiquity. People would move from place to place. In this country, it's well documented that Native people would follow the buffalo, which was a mainstay of their diet. They would follow the buffalo from one region to the other. If there was a drought in one area, they would simply move to another. That was done throughout the world.
Okay.
Well, it wasn't until Europeans came and decided to create boundaries that all that began to change.
I see. Can you indicate what some of the people did? How did they live?
Well, according to Dr. Van Sertima, and he wrote the book that came before Columbus, and it's probably a must read for anyone who's interested in the history of this country from the perspective of a Black person, right? It talks about these Olmecs, amongst other people, had very high and advanced civilization. And when they came here, you can see it from some of the structure that they erected or helped to erect in Mexico, in parts of Central America, in South America. And as I said, when we were talking off camera, some of these structures, these pyramids, if you will, have the same dimensions as some of the Great Pyramid or the Great Pyramid in Egypt. How did that happen? This is not a coincidence. This shows the same technology that was used to build these pyramids in Egypt or Kemet with same dimensions and same technology used to build them here in this country. And these pyramids were used for the same purposes as they were in Africa. So when you think of a pyramid, you think in terms of the final resting place of the king and queen, when actually the pyramids were much more. The pyramids were actually temples where people would go to worship, to study, and also you would prepare the burial place, the final resting place for the king, the queen, and the royal servants and others. But, they were just so much more than just a burial place.
Right.
These were actual temples. And I think it's important to understand that for the indigenous Kemetic people, I'm talking about the founders of what's called Kemet or Egypt, they did not have a religion. What they had was a spiritual system, but that spiritual system is the basis for all religions that have followed.
Okay.
So all these religions came out of a non-religion.
So I'm religious part. So you said they mostly focus on the spirituality.
Yes.
So do you know, because based on the spirituality, how these different religions came about? Like, there's the Christians, the Jews, but since you said that's the birth, how did the division, that part?
Well, when the Europeans came to Kemet, they came first as students, and they studied the spiritual system of Kemet. And they took that back to Europe. And from that, what we find is Greek and Roman mythology. So you find that there were gods of thunder, which would be Thor or Apollo. These were all taken from Kemet. So what they did was they took these deities from Kemet and they took them back to Europe, changed the name and changed their appearance.
Okay.
And they became part of the Greek and Roman pantheon of their gods. But all that was from what they observed in Kemet. Later on, other religions came about, and I guess partially out of power struggles. In European history, you have constant wars, even amongst Christian nations. Spain fought England. Spain was Catholic, England was Protestant. So they fought for control of religion.
Right.
So people recognized the power of religion. So they started creating religions based on what was called, I guess, Egyptian folklore. So the story of Jesus is not a new story. It is a story that was told throughout Kemet thousands of years before there was ever a Christian. The story is based on Horus and Set, two brothers. One brother killed the other and buried his body. His wife, who was Isis, put the body back together, but could not find his penis. Yet she was able to conceive a child. That child was the first immaculate conception. The child was called Heru. So from that, you get the story of an immaculate conception. And Heru would do things like raise the dead and things of those, and the same things that you see happening in the Bible that Jesus was doing. This came about from the study of Heru and what he had done thousands of years before. So all these religions are based on, I mean, I'll give you a good example. If you were to look at, say, a Egyptian king or queen for that matter, what you find is they wear this crown, typically red and white, representative of Upper and Lower Egypt or Kemet. That crown you see every day when you see the Pope. Why does the Pope wear the same crown that the king or so-called pharaoh of Egypt wore? So a lot of this is taken, this Catholic religion, the confession, and keep in mind, a lot of Catholicism is based on the worship of idols.
Okay, right.
Where did they get that from? That came right out of what they observed in Kemet. So Catholicism, Judaism, Islam, all of those have a basis in the Egyptian or Kemetic spiritual system.
Okay. Wow, I didn't even know that. And I didn't even know that Kemet, was like the base. Going into Kemet, right? You said that was more of a spirituality, correct?
Well, yeah, the place was called Kemet, right? When the Greeks came, they changed it to Egypt or Egyptos.
Okay.
But the original people called it Kemet or Land of the Black. They made it clear who they were. And they kept very accurate records in, of course, the Greeks called it hieroglyphics, but the original people called it Medunetia. So in their Medunetia or writings, they documented who they were, where they came from. And of course, there are hundreds of pictures that show that these were clearly Black Africans. There is no way that you can deny the characteristics, the Afrocentric characteristics. And people still do. It's strange when you think about it, that the only place on the planet that has an entire field of study devoted to it is Egypt. There's no Americanology, there's no Israelology, there's only Egyptology. So people have tried for years to understand the technology and the intellect of these people who founded what's called Egypt. And even today, people still try to deny the Africanness of these people. But if you do a little research, you find that Egypt is broken down into Upper and Lower Egypt or Kemet.
Right.
So because the Nile River flows backwards, it flows from south to north, that the founders of Kemet followed the path of the river. So for those who lived in, say, Lower Egypt, which would be the northern portion of Egypt, for them, the southern portion or Upper Egypt was the Holy Land. It was the Holy of Holies for them. So on a modern map, that land or Upper Egypt, the southern part, is today's Sudan. Originally, it was Nubia. So for, and it's documented throughout, even in the Bible. It talks about how Nubians would go north in these periods where Europeans would sit on the throne. The Nubians would come north and drive the Europeans out and reestablish pure African kings and queens on the throne of Kemet.
Lady K.